Welcome. Thank you for coming to the Wayland Library this evening. Thank you for joining us on Zoom. Tonight, we are excited to have James Parr here to talk about World War II, Massachusetts. We are recording this for broadcast on Waycam and also on the library YouTube page. If you have any questions on Zoom, feel free to put them in the chat and I will raise my hand. Your presentation is about an hour. Do you want people to hold questions or do it throughout?
You can interrupt.
We can interrupt.
Sure.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad to welcome James Parr here, the author of World War II, Massachusetts, and other titles which you, if you're here in the room, can check out. Framingham Legends and Lore, Murder and Mayhem in Metro West Boston, which we hope to hear more about here in Wayland in the fall, and Dedham Historic and Heroic Tales of Shireton. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I am a retired educator. I taught in Framingham for 27 years, a total of 34 years. And so researching interesting stories that have, some of which have been lost to time is one of my hobbies. I've been doing it for about 15 years or so, and I present my stories in various forms like haunted Halloween trolley tours or first person, dressing up reenactors at cemeteries, and also these talks with my books. So this is my book, World War II, Massachusetts, which came out in March. So I'm going to actually have my notes are on my phone, so I'm not texting. If you see me looking down at my phone, it's just easier. So I'm going to start on Tuesday, December 9th, 1941. So this is 2 days after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. And we're in Boston, and things are happening around the state. People are scared, they're confused, they don't know what's happening. There are extra guards that are put around at various places, at bridges, at municipal water supplies. The recruitment centers have been overwhelmed with the amount of young men that have come to enlist just 2 days after the bombing, and only 1 day after America declared war on Japan. And so around about noon in Boston, suddenly people started to hear air raid sirens. And kind of a scary thing. But there is a silver lining to this. So for a while there, they sprang into action. There were civil defense coordinators and first aid and fire and police responding. Workers were sent home from some of the, like the Navy Yard. Children were sent home from their schools. And Governor Saltonstall, the governor at the time was Leverett Saltonstall, he came on the radio and told everyone that there were airplanes, enemy airplanes were 2 hours away. And so for about an hour and a half, not just Boston, but the whole East Coast from New York north were fearful that they were about to be attacked. It turned out that it was a false alarm. That's because we would have heard about this. It was a miscommunication from Mitchell Field in New York. But as I said, the silver lining is that it showed that the preparations that had been started long before the war started actually were in place, and that Massachusetts was in pretty good shape if we were to be attacked by, which in that case would have been the Germans, even though we weren't technically at war with them. And so a lot of what you hear about World War II on the home front, when you hear about blackouts and civil defense and the air raid warden, making people, turn their lights off and use blackout curtains, most of that was because of the fear of attack, which never happened. But of course, they didn't know that at the time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and I'm also going to talk about the inconveniences that people experienced throughout the 4 years of the war. I've divided my book into several sections. The first one is preparation. So as I said, the Massachusetts Safety Committee had actually formed in August of 1940, and they had already started to train people. A lot of the responsibilities were divided up into the towns. So a town like Wayland would have its own committee, and rather than centralize it in Massachusetts, even though they had a committee, they would have Wayland would have its own committee, and they would have people who were responsible for first aid, for training, and throughout you know, that year and a couple of months before the war started, there were people who were being trained in first aid. They were trained in how to put out an incendiary fire. They were trained in how to black out your home so that light wouldn't escape and help enemy bombers find you. And that was, like I said, that started a good year before we actually were in the war. Some other important events, and what I say is, if you were to look at any of the polls from those years, it's hard to get a gauge on how people felt because it was constantly changing. And they would ask questions like, should we support Great Britain and go to this war? This is starting in 1939, or after Hitler invaded Poland in 39. And they would also ask, do you think we will go to war? And depending on who they were asking and what particular time it was, people had different responses. However, all you had to do starting in 1940 was look around you and see that we were indeed a country that was preparing for war, and also a country that was affected by war, whether we liked it or not, or whether we wanted to be an isolationist country or not. So I've highlighted some of the important events leading up to Pearl Harbor. April 6th, they had groundbreaking ceremonies at Westover Field. That was an air base out by the Springfield, in the Springfield area. That was brand new, you know, from the ground up. The other ones that I bolded are September 16th was the first peacetime draft since the Civil War. And I'll talk a little bit about that further. Soldiers were expected to serve for 1 year. Of course, that changed once we got into the war. Also in September of 1940, Camp Edwards on Cape Cod, which had already existed, but it was a very small operation. It was leased to the Army for 99 years, and it was expanded to the point where it became the largest camp in Massachusetts. In 1941, I'm going to skip down to the bottom. The battleship USS Massachusetts was launched at Quincy Shipyard. The shipyard had a long history of producing ships, warships, and the battleship Massachusetts you can still see today down in Fall River at Battleship Cove. So those are some of the military events that people could see were happening around them. Some of the more personal things, if you look at 1941, in August, there were two things that had a big effect on people. Again, it was not like earth-shattering, but it certainly changed their lifestyle and made things a little inconvenient for them. The first one was August 8th, when silk production in the United States was halted. Silk imports had already stopped from Japan. And if you were a woman in 1941, your silk stockings were like a mainstay of your wardrobe. Women, for the most part, did not go out in public without wearing skirts and dresses and stockings. And so this had a big impact on their everyday life, their convenience. Then that same week, what happened was, I'm going to go to this chart here because this is a little easier to read. The same week that happened, gas stations, there was a gas it wasn't a ban, but it was a restriction where gas sales took place from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. And part of the reason for that was that 1/5 of the tanker fleet had been turned over to Britain. And that was the fleet that served the East Coast. So there just wasn't the oil production to make the gas. And that affected mostly the East Coast. And then later on, when the war started, there were gas rationing across the country, but New England felt it first. So, and then we have December 7th, Pearl Harbor is attacked. And interestingly, leading up to that, you know, if you read the newspapers and the headlines, I mean, they're talking about impending war with Germany. And that's up until maybe the week before the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan is barely mentioned. The stories would be on page 5 or 6. And Germany was taking all the headlines. So just an interesting, so it indeed was a surprise for many people when Pearl Harbor was attacked. So this is the draft that took place. The draft was instituted in September, and then they pulled the names in October of 1940. That's Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He's pulling the lucky number 158 out of that big, they were in capsules, out of that big cylinder there. And a lot of my stories, and this is a good example of them, a lot of my stories are stories that people would hear and they go, wow, that's incredible. Or if anyone remembers the old Ripley's Believe It or Not, it used to be like a cartoon in the paper. And this would be one of those stories that certainly would make it there. And so this fella here, his name is Alden C. Flagg. He's from Acton. And his number was pulled first, number 158, as was his father's during World War I. So interestingly, and I looked him up. He did survive the war, and he lived to a nice ripe old age. So he was one of those interesting stories that came out of those that draft there. Again, this is before the war starts. The V stands for victory, not for vanity. That is actually an ad for nylon stockings from the department store Gilchrist's. Gilchrist used to be, they had one in downtown Framingham, there was one in downtown Boston, and they actually took out an ad. It was an open letter to women who have been storming hosiery counters across America, because there were so-called hosiery riots. Women were hoarding the silk stockings, and so they decided, all right, we're going to push our nylon stockings. Nylon stockings had only been around for about a year, and eventually the military would take over the nylon production as well. But at the time, nylon stockings were much more available. And so they were sort of appealing to women's patriotism to go buy their nylon stockings. And if you see the ad, that's actually that little gray section is actually a stockinged leg that comes down, and so people were being kind of clever with the events that were happening. And the girls below that decided, well, we're going to be really patriotic, and we're not going to wear anything on our legs. So they are going bare-legged, which might have been a little controversial. Now, the youths next to them, these are some youths from Maine who came down for a Red Sox game, but they happened to come down on the very day that this gas restriction went into effect from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. They didn't know about it. So they got stuck, and this is one of many pictures I found across New England where people did not know about a rule change, and they ran out of gas, and there were pictures of cars being towed away. And I use this picture to show that if you really wanted to reduce the amount of inconvenience in your life, you really had to be on the ball as a mother, as a father, as a worker. You had to know what rules were being changed because they were changing constantly. You had to keep up, and a lot of this was in the paper, so you could look in your daily paper or hear it on the radio. But if you weren't aware, and if you didn't keep your wits about you, you could be really inconvenienced like these guys were. And they're all laughing and joking because the war hasn't started yet. But this will come out throughout the 4 years of the war, that there will be restrictions put in very quickly. Some of them then are taken away, and people just need to know what's going on. Otherwise, they're going to be caught by surprise. So the next section of my book I call Reaction Adaptation. And these are the events that happened. The reaction is immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and then the adaptation is ways that people adapted over the next few months and years. I talked about the false alarm on December 9th. And as I said, the threat of attack by air was really strong. Germany and Italy declared war on the US on December 11th. And being a coastal city, if the Germans were going to fly across the Atlantic and attack any cities, Boston would be one of them. And so they took precautions. This is one of them. And if you've ever gone on a duck tour, I think this is one of their favorite things to tell you, is that the Golden Dome of the State House was painted battleship gray for the duration of the war. And indeed it was. They scraped off the gold leaf and painted it battleship gray. That was in March of 42. One of the worries, again, was attack by air. However, there was one that maybe we don't really think about as much, because I'm sure that a lot of these storytellers will tell you that, they were worried about the airplanes, zooming in on the light. But something that you don't hear about much often is what's called sky glow, sky glow is the vertical illumination, artificial illumination up into the sky. And it wasn't so much that it would be something that would allow planes to hone in on a city, but it would silhouette any ships that were out at sea. And this young lady here is holding a poster, and you can see that that's a ship there, and that ship is silhouetted by the glowing city behind it. And it's also a reminder of the the dim out time, dusk to dawn. And again, the things that you had to be aware of, because they would publish this in the newspaper because it changed with the seasons. So in the Globe, I saw, these are the dim out hours, and they would have, and I'll tell you what a dim out is in a minute. And they would have the hours that you needed to follow these restrictions. And after the war, or even during the war, when they captured some of the U-boats, they read their logs. And there was one particular one. This is a U-boat captain who made it all the way into Boston Harbor and laid some mines in the harbor. Nothing had happened with them, thankfully. But in his log, he talked about how Boston was just lit up like it was Christmas Eve with lights, and he had no trouble, being able to find his way into the city. And I'll talk a little bit later about the number of Allied ships that were sunk because of in the early parts of the war because of things like sky glow. So the map there is from the Globe. Again, this is to inform the citizens, and it's the Greater Boston Anti-Glare Area. It's a 12-mile circle around the city of Boston, and the arrow is right about where we are. So Wayland was just outside of the area, so we're not within 12 miles of Boston, but where I grew up, Dedham is right in there. And then if you go further down south, you see Plymouth. And then the gray areas were Cape Cod and the islands, and that was a little bit different too. So there were restrictions about your headlights had to be dimmed. If you were parking, you couldn't park facing the ocean, facing the shore. Street lights, maybe every other street light was not turned on, and they had special shields over them so they wouldn't reflect up. And there is a difference between a blackout and a dim out. And in a lot of old movies, I watch a lot of old movies, and they take place in World War II, and they talk about the blackout, and some of them are comedies, because it's totally pitch black. But a blackout didn't happen that often. A blackout was more like a practice, so that if there were enemy planes coming, how quickly could the citizens distinguish all light? And it was usually done on a small scale, like a town would say, next Thursday there's going to be a blackout, or it could be a county. There was a headline, I don't have it in this slideshow, but it said, it was from the Dedham transcript, and it said that citizens are ready for the surprise blackout next Tuesday. And a dim out, so the dim out actually lasted for several years during the war. And the dim out were those restrictions that I told you about, where the light was reduced, especially around the coast, for the duration of the war. One of the other things that happened, which was more than just inconvenient. So as I said, Germany and Italy declared war on December 11th. And FDR, President Roosevelt, at that same time, he declared 200,000 German, Italian, and Japanese people as enemy aliens. And that meant that they had to do certain things. First of all, they had to register by February of 42. They had to turn in their cameras. They had to turn in firearms, shortwave radios. Their movement was restricted. So if they wanted to go to another town to visit relatives, they had to get permission. This was something that would later come up, especially in Massachusetts and Boston, where there was such a huge Italian population. This picture is actually of the Italian fishing fleet. And the Italian fishing fleet was barred from going out into the harbor because they were afraid that they might bring supplies out to any enemy ships. So you can see the level of fear. It's almost bordering on the irrational, but if you put yourself in their position, or if you think about those days after 9/11, when people had no idea what was going on, it kind of makes sense. Over the course of the war, the Italians, they had a strong lobbying presence. A lot of Italian American groups, like the Knights of Columbus, the Catholic Church, and so they lobbied, and these restrictions were actually lifted in November of 1942 for the Italians. So they weren't as strict with the Italians. Rationing was the next thing that came in the spring of 42, and rationing was either to have some of these supplies and these products go to military use, or because we couldn't get the materials or the ingredients we needed because of the war. They couldn't be shipped to the United States. One of the first things to be rationed was sugar. And I like to tell this story as a former teacher. I always ask, like, if you had an unruly crowd that was like really probably angry and frustrated and impatient, and you had to organize them and take information and then pass it on. Who would you ask to do that? Teachers. And so in May, for about 3 or 4 days, all the elementary schools were closed. The kids were probably happy about that. And people in that town went down to their local elementary school. They had to answer some questions about who was living in their family, how many people, and then they got their sugar ration card. And then not too long after that, the teachers were called out again to do the same thing for gas rationing. And I put this headline in from Taunton that, again, I do stress that everybody was all in to win this war, but there's always going to be some bad actors. And this is a headline where some of the gas rationing books were stolen because someone's going to, take advantage of the situation. These are just some headlines of some of the other things that were either banned or restricted. The electric signs was, along with the street lights and the headlights. Shoes were rationed, for the leather. Bicycles were rationed. Rubber was, they had not really developed good synthetic rubber at this point. They couldn't really recycle the rubber that was turned in because it had already been recycled once. So, and that affected a lot of things that you wouldn't realize had rubber in them. The different ice cream flavors is probably because of the sugar. And then the fireworks ban, that was a state ban that came in 43, and that ban is still in effect, but it began during World War II in 1943. So it's been around for quite a long time. You have personal fireworks. This is one of the ones I found interesting. Sliced bread was banned for a very short time. And the thinking, I guess, was that there was steel in the slicers, and that steel could be used to make, tanks and planes and what have you. And so leading up to the ban, which started in January 43, there were all kinds of ads telling people how they could slice their bread. And if you know the old saying, the greatest thing since sliced bread, this really brings it home because people love their sliced bread. It had only been around since 1928, but there were a generation who never knew anything different. And one of the things was, it's just convenient. Kids can go make their own sandwiches. And if they have to slice their own bread, well, who knows what's going to happen. So like the hosiery riots, it caused some sliced bread riots. There were bakeries who had sliced bread because they had either extra slicers or what have you. And there were a lot of letters to the editor saying, why, we're already miserable. Why are you taking away our sliced bread? And so this is one of the restrictions that was actually overturned. And it only lasted from January to March of 43. And this is a quote from an ad for Wonder Bread that appeared in the Boston Globe the day that the ban was lifted. What a joy to not have to slice bread. What a blessing that children may once again help themselves to good bread. Now more than ever in these days of rationing and food shortages, Wonder Bread comes as a godsend. I guess that's why it's called Wonder Bread. This is the front page of some sheet music of a song called Hitch Old Dobbin to the Shay Again. So Old Dobbin was a name that people used to just refer to a horse. Like, I see you got Old Dobbin out again. It didn't matter what the horse's name was. They were all Old Dobbin. And because of the gas shortage, because of the rubber shortage, people got creative and they decided, all right, well, we have horses. Horses had been pretty much gone from the city streets, except for there were a few, the Iceman, the Ragman. Even in my time, apparently, I've seen pictures of Boston. There's a Ragman who was in Boston up to the 60s, but it was, there were one or two of them. And so it had been quite some time, but there were still horses around. And so horses were utilized in a lot of different ways. There were delivery trucks. The Boston Herald newspaper had like about 20 horse-drawn carts built so that they could deliver to their distributors by horse. I think, yeah, so what they had to do though, because it had been some time since there were horses all over the cities, they had to go back and sort of retrofit and fix up some of these amenities that horses used to have. This is a water fountain that is still in Newton Center, and that had been either filled in like it is here last year as a planter, or some of them were filled with concrete. Some of them were removed because they were driving hazards. They were disconnected from the municipal water supply. And so the picture on the left is actually when they welcomed the horse back and they refurbished the water fountain so that old Dobbin could get his water. I found that it just seemed to me that this was sort of another fad, like the sliced bread. It made a lot of headlines. There were just dozens and dozens of pictures. But it didn't seem like people were really that invested in it because it was a little problematic. They needed to have rubber shoes to walk on the the streets as they were paved now, and there wasn't any rubber. And then there weren't enough oats, and so it kind of faded away. But they did find another great use for old Dobbin.
Oh, God.
And around that time, this is from early 1943, the government started promoting horse meat as an alternative to beef. So beef was rationed. Beef was very hard to come by and expensive. And they, as I said, they offered horse meat as a tender and tasty alternative. They talked about, there were ads and about their government pamphlets even about how the French loved horse meat. And you could do so many different things with it. You could have all these different kinds of cuts of horse meat. The Harvard Club actually had a horse meat special that was very popular. You could get a horse meat steak and potatoes and onions. And the rest of this ad, which I feel is kind of unnecessary, is there was no waiting if you went to buy your horse meat. But again, as I said, there were bad actors, people taking advantage. There were people who were passing off horse meat as beef. So they made a couple of rules. You couldn't have ground horse meat anymore because it looked too much like hamburger. And if you were selling horse meat, you had to have the letters on the package be 1 inch high. So it was very clear that this is horse meat. But then there was black market horse meat. There were people passing it off as beef, and that it never really caught on, and it sort of faded from the public's eye. The next section of the book I call participation. This is where everyone from grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, kids, even to the family pet was able to find a way to participate in the war effort. One of the ways that everybody could was to buy a war bond. War bonds they not only helped finance the war, but they helped keep inflation down, and they also got everybody to sort of think as one, and it was really a propaganda effort. It was Henry Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, who actually enlisted a propaganda expert. So it wasn't by accident. His name was Peter Odegaard, and he was a professor at Amherst College, and he was an expert in propaganda. And propaganda, in this case, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's trying to get, people to buy in to a particular cause or a particular philosophy. And so, again, it's no accident that he chose this symbol, which is the Concord Minuteman. And the Minuteman symbol was on everything that had to do with war bonds. It was on the posters. This is actually a poster advertising war bonds. It was on stamps. Stamps were a way that kids could buy, like in 10-cent or 25-cent denominations, and put them all together, and then they could turn it in for a bond. And it was on ads that you would see in the newspaper for war bonds. War bonds, you could have it deducted out of your pay. You could go down to a local war bond, it's not really a store, but it was like a war bond center. You could buy them at banks, and you could also go to a rally. So these are a couple of rallies for war bonds, which have something in common, and a lot of these had this in common, which was a way to, if you couldn't beat Hitler on the battlefield just yet, then you could certainly beat him in the hearts and minds of the American people, and on the common, a Boston Common in one case and Natick Common in the other. So let's start with the picture with the girls there in their Sunday best. So that's on Boston Common, and this is sponsored by radio station WEI. And if you bought a bond, then you got to hammer a nail into Hitler's coffin, and that's what those girls are doing. The other picture is from the Natick Common, and this is one of my favorite stories that I found while researching this. The name on the tombstone is Schicklgruber. So there was a mistaken rumor that went around that Hitler's real last name was Schicklgruber. It was not. It was his father's last name when his father was born, but his mother remarried a man named Hitler. So it was actually Adolf Hitler's name, but it doesn't sound quite as threatening when you think of that, Schicklgruber. It made people, it gave them a way to mock him. So there are lots and lots of references to Schicklgruber, and it also gave them a way to not have to say his name. So this particular bond rally, it was in September of 42, and it started with a parade through Natick Center, and they had effigies of the top three, which are Hirohito, Mussolini, and Schicklgruber. They were hanging from a hay wagon. When they got to the Natick Town Common, they had a big auction to raise money for the war effort. There was a autographed Lou Gehrig baseball. There were celebrities there. There was Joe Cronin, who was the player manager of the Red Sox. There were some radio stars there. And then right at midnight, after the band played the old jazz tune, "I'll Be Glad When You're Dead, You Rascal You," they buried Schicklgruber on the common. And that would have been the end of the story, except there were some citizens in town who didn't want that particular person buried on their common. So they dug him up a few days later. And he was in a coffin. They brought the coffin to the Waltham dump where they left it. Somebody else came by, happened to be a movie producer, not anyone famous that I've ever heard of. And he picked up the coffin and brought it to Boston, and he auctioned it to whoever bought the highest denomination war bond. So a woman from the North Shore purchased it for a $500 bond. And her plan was to dump it in Boston Harbor, kind of like a Boston Tea Party. And she was stopped by the Coast Guard. So she enlisted some friends, and they kind of snuck out, and they went to the Fort Point Channel Bridge and tossed the casket into the ocean, into the channel there, and washed out to sea. And that was the end of Schicklgruber. But there were many, nothing quite like that, but there were lots of these bond drives. There were, Hollywood celebrities who came to Boston and would perform and would promote the sale of war bonds. Oh, I went too far there. Kids were incentivized. They could win prizes. Oh, we have a question. Yes.
Oh, yes, going back one slide to the Freedom's Sake.
Yes.
They're wondering what are the buildings next to the Minuteman Man on the buy war bonds?
Oh, I don't think that, I didn't look in, I don't think there are any particular buildings. I think it's kind of looking just like New England.
Yeah.
Which is, I think when people think of America and liberty and freedom, they think of the American Revolution. And I think this particular scene certainly, evokes that.
Mhm.
That would be my guess.
Okay, thanks.
It could be right down the street here. It looks very similar to where we are now.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this looks like the church in Welland. So I was saying, kids, they got prizes like movie tickets. There was 3 children in, one was from Norwood, I know, who they sold like a lot of bonds, enough bonds, and so they actually won the privilege of going up to South Portland, Maine, and they got to christen a ship. They got to smash the bottle against it. Towns, schools would, if they raised enough money, the Army would say that they bought a Jeep, and so they would drive, a Jeep, and they would drive it right to the school, and all the kids would gather and they'd take their picture and it'd be in the newspaper. So it was an all-out effort for everyone to constantly be doing something, so feel like they had a part in this. So this is not too far from it. This is the Concord Free Public Library, and this is a little bit of a mystery, but not really, if you know. But this is a picture, a postcard from like 1905. It's the same building there, and it has this decorative iron fence around it. And then this is a picture I took of the granite, and there's a hole there. And I was told years ago that whenever you see a hole like this, it means that they took the iron fence and they recycled it for scrap during the war. And I said, well, maybe, I just didn't know. So I wanted to find evidence of that. And I did. So I kept searching through the newspaper archives, which is where I do most of my research. And I did find an article. Concord had what they called Junk Rally Week. It was in 1942. They had a parade with an effigy of Schicklgruber, of course. And in that article, it said that they were going to dismantle this fence, and they were going to, what they would do is they would then sell it to scrap dealers, who would then sell it to the government to be recycled. And so this is actual this fence actually was donated to the war effort. And there were other stories about people, I'll show you in a minute. At first it was like scrap, which was real scrap, like old farm tools that aren't used anymore, junked out cars. And then it went from there to just anything that was made out of metal that people didn't particularly see a use for. And in some cases, they sacrificed their history. This is in the middle is a picture of Governor Leverett Saltonstall. He's got a welder's mask on and gloves, and he's got a torch, and he's blasting away at Hitler's face. But that's the decorative fence around the State House with the gray dome there. That was taken down, and there was, a couple of tons of metal were taken out of that. Mayor Tobin, Maurice Tobin, not to be outdone, he went over to Old City Hall, and he put on his mask and got his welder's torch and his gloves and started blasting the fence there, and promptly set his shoes on fire. And so, but they did get the fence down, and he was a good mayor. He later became governor. So after the book came out, and I was just researching some more, and I found this headline: Tobin burns himself putting torch to the fence. I said, yeah, I already know about that. And I looked at the date. I said, wait a minute, he did it twice. So he did it like a week later at the Common. He burned himself. So, you got to give him A for effort, though. Now, both of these fences have since been replaced. I don't know when. I wasn't able to find that out, but a lot of places you go to Boston, like on Beacon Hill and some of those brownstones and those brick houses, and you look and you can see where the holes where there used to be a fence. This is an example of how two different towns dealt with it. So Dedham, where I grew up, this is a cannon that stood outside the American Legion post for years, and supposedly came from the USS Constitution. Although I think that if every cannon that was claimed to have come from the USS Constitution was real, there would have been like 9,000 cannon on that ship. But anyway, so they sent it to the scrap heap with a note on it. A lot of them had notes written on it, back to the Axis from Dedham. Then the other story is about Walpole, where people said, well, no, that's our history. They also had a cannon from the Constitution, and they had a bell from the Civil War. And I just found this recently, so I have not come to the, I don't know whether these were sacrificed or not. There was a guy the other night at a talk I gave from Walpole who said, well, there is a cannon that I just saw last week by the soccer field, and it looks kind of old. So it could be it's still there. But again, it's not that everybody didn't just say, yeah, take our history, our canon. Some people are like, wait a minute. And so I want people to realize that, it wasn't always that cut and dry about, well, we're at war, so let's do it. There were people who did have concerns. Here's another way people could participate, and that was they could work at, hundreds and hundreds of jobs that were now available. Lots of ads that I've seen were specifically asking for women because there weren't a lot of men around, and they would appeal to, do it for Johnny who's overseas. A lot of the companies were converted to manufacturing, war materials and supplies, and some continue to manufacture the things that they always did, but they shipped them off to Europe and, Asia. This was at Somerville Assembly Square, which is still there. I don't know if it's still the Assembly Square Mall or what they call it now. I think it's mixed use. But they had been building forts there, and then they turned it over to production of this vehicle called a Bren gun carrier. It was mostly used by the British Army. So it was an armed gun carrier. I think it carried 6 soldiers. There is one, that colored picture is actually at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson. And that is an example of a Bren gun carrier. And the top is the assembly line at Somerville, where they're coming off the line. The service flag I have on the podium here was a way to show that you had a family member participating in the military. So the service flag that you would fly in your window, you would have a blue star. You would have 1 blue star for every service member who was in the military. If that service member died, then you'd have a gold star. And if you had a company, so the picture on the right is the Boston Globe. So companies would put the flag out showing how many of their citizens were fighting on how many have been killed, and also some town halls. I know that in Framingham, I've seen a picture of this very similar flag hanging from the Framingham Town Hall with numbers on it, how many servicemen were in the war and how many were killed. Probably the award, not probably, definitely, for the most stars was a woman named Annie Jordan. She was a widow from Jamaica Plain. And I found an article where there's a picture of her putting her 10th blue star on the flag for her 10th son who was fighting overseas. I mentioned before that it was the whole family could get involved, including the family pet. So this was one of the most remarkable things I found, the Dogs for Defense program. So Dogs for Defense was the brainchild of Harry Caesar. He was a businessman. He was the president of the American Kennel Club. And his idea was to have, this was in January 42, so like right after the war started, to recruit 125,000 dogs from families of any breed. They just had to be a particular size and probably age, to do whatever needed to be done. Most of them were kept here in the United States, and they would guard like munitions factories or military bases, but some of them were shipped overseas and saw action. And as I said, it was all breeds, except they found that chows, for whatever reason, were not workable. So chows were not accepted. I find that kind of amusing. So these dogs would go to regional training centers, and they would train by professionals. And from there, they would go for more training to military bases. And then some of them might be shipped overseas. Some of them turned out to be too friendly. I found several instances where people got letters saying, you know, your Fido was just too friendly, so we're going to send them back to you. Some of them, as I say, saw action. So in the picture, we have two young kids. Their names are Anne and Robert McKenzie. They're from Randolph, and that's their dog, Sailor. The story goes that they were listening to the radio and they heard an ad asking for, it was the Dogs for Defense program, and they begged their parents to sign up Sailor because they had an uncle who was in the service. He was a sailor. That's where the dog got his name. Sailor actually went to Burma, which is where my father was, China, Burma, India. And there was some fierce fighting in Burma, in the jungles. And Sailor was trained to sniff out the enemy. And he had a handler named Rusty Meisner. Rusty was from the Midwest. And he actually saved his life twice by alerting to some Japanese soldiers who were hiding in the jungle, and they were snipers, and Rusty was able to take care of them. And by the end of the war, Rusty was really attached to Sailor, as you can imagine. And he wrote to the family, the McKenzie family in Randolph, to ask if he could keep the dog. And it kind of became a drama that was played out in the press. There were people who said, yeah, give him the dog, you know, and there were people who said, no, the kids want the dog back. There was a man in Cambridge who offered a puppy, an Irish setter puppy, to the family, but they persisted and they wanted Sailor back, and they got him back. And so he spent the rest of his days with the McKenzie family. The dog in the middle is named Bessie, and these two just happen to be German Shepherds, but they weren't all German Shepherds. So Bessie was a dog from Dedham that was owned by a family there, and this is her honorable discharge. And it says, I'll read it. It says, the war dog Bessie, tattooed number 1H76, having served with the armed forces of the United States of America, is hereby awarded this certificate of faithful service and honorable discharge. And it has her, she was in for 2 years, from October of 43 till October of 45, in Nebraska, where I'm assuming she was probably trained in Nebraska and served in Maryland at a Coast Guard station. And Betsy came back, and she lived out her days in Dedham and was buried in the backyard under her favorite blanket. The next section is fortification. So even though it is about the home front, there was so much going on militarily in Massachusetts that I couldn't ignore it. And it was very important stuff too. So these are just some of the military installations. The ones on the top left, Fort Devens, Camp Edwards, Camp Miles Standish, Camp Framingham. Some of those were like intake centers. They were training grounds. Fort Devens was where my father was inducted. So you would go to your local, enlistment office, and then most of the soldiers from Massachusetts would go through Fort Devens and then they'd be shipped off. I think my father went to Fort Dix in New Jersey and was trained there. Camp Edwards on the Cape was the largest one. Camp Miles Standish down in Taunton was, it was a sort of a clearinghouse where there were supplies and soldiers went there and then they went off to Boston to the port of embarkation. Below that is where things were manufactured. The Watertown Arsenal and Springfield Armory had already been in existence for hundreds of years, as was the Boston Navy Yard. And so they, you know, they were adapted for wartime use. South Weymouth Naval Air Station was actually a blimp station, and that was for U-boat patrols, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. There was a naval air station at Squantum. There was Westover Field, as I mentioned. The harbors, New Bedford Harbor had forts that were probably a couple of hundred years old at that point, or maybe 100 years old, as did Boston Harbor. Some of them were Civil War era forts, and so they were retrofitted with guns to protect the harbor. The New Bedford one was also to protect the south entrance to the Cape Cod Canal, and there were other fortifications put on the northern entrance. And then there were ammunition storage facilities. There was one in Hingham. There was one, you know, kind of right down the road in Maynard. I'll talk a little bit about. The Boston Navy Yard, the Fort River Shipyard. My mother and her sister and her father all worked at the Navy Yard. And a lot of these places employed like hundreds of civilians as well as military. So the U-boat activity was, I talked about the sky glow, and U-boats actually were a threat, more so than any threat of an airplane attack. So in fact, in the first 3 weeks of 1942, there were 35 Allied merchant ships that were sunk off the Atlantic coast. And a lot of them, it was because of this sky glow. So the blimps were patrol blimps. They were armed, they had guns, they had some explosive devices. They had, there were 8 of them of one type and 2 of another type at South Weymouth. And they would go on regular patrols along the New England coast. There was another one down in New Jersey, so they would go up as far as Nova Scotia and go down to wherever the New Jersey range ended. And they didn't actually engage any of the enemy, any of these blimps. However, there were U-boats that engaged quite a few, you know, non-military ships. This is a story, U-boat shells Boston trawler. That's another crazy story. It was a fishing trawler out of Boston called the Lark. And in June of 44, they were attacked by a U-boat. They all survived, even the ship's dog. And they came back to Boston, and there were just these massive holes from the shells from the U-boat. They counted 500 bullet holes in the sails of this ship. Later on, that particular U-boat was sunk, but it just showed that, you know, and this was not really towards the end of the war, but it was close to that it still was a danger to be out there on the seas. Out of the Quincy shipyard, we get this interesting story of Kilroy. So some of you may have heard of Kilroy. It was an expression, it's a slogan, it's a drawing. Today we'd call it a meme. Kilroy was here. It started appearing in Europe on battlefields, on, you know, on burnt out buildings, on walls, on artillery shells. And at the end, toward the end of the war, it kind of made its way back to the States, and it was everywhere. There were Kilroy jazz recordings made. There was a Kilroy Was Here movie. Kids would write it, doodle it on their notebooks. They would use it as an excuse, like, oh, I don't have my homework. Kilroy took it. And it became a nationwide phenomenon. And after the war was over, people were like, well, who's Kilroy? Where did Kilroy come from? So one guy named James Kilroy of Everett, somebody found him and decided that he was Kilroy, that he was training down in Florida, and his friend got shipped to Italy, and Kilroy was sick, so he had to stay behind. And his friend he missed him, and he started writing, Kilroy is coming. And that sort of evolved into Kilroy Was Here. It didn't get a lot of popularity, that story didn't really leave New England. A year later, the Boston Elevated Railway had a contest, an essay contest, to see who could write the best essay proving that they were Kilroy. And the winner was James Kilroy of Halifax, Massachusetts. He claimed that he worked at the Quincy shipyard, that part is true, and he said that he would write it after he inspected rivets, which is one story. There are a couple of different variations, but that he would write it while he was inspecting ships at the Quincy shipyard. So they liked his story. They declared him the winner, and they gave him his prize, which was a 20-ton 1910 model streetcar that you see being lifted onto a a truck to be shipped down to his home in Halifax,
Oh
Massachusetts.
my God.
Which he actually had a need for that. He had 9 children. And he used it as like a playroom and extra sleeping quarters for his 9 children. This is the what they call the Maynard, the Army dump. And I put this in here because it's local, but also a lot of these military bases that were built, they displaced quite a few people. And these are people who had lived in this area for hundreds of years, generations. They were farmers, and some of them did not get, very much notice that they had to get off their land. Some of them felt like they didn't get what they deserved for their land. This was 4 square miles in Maynard and Sudbury and Stowe. And I think there were 139 families who were moved off their land. And this happened, it happened in Hingham, it happened in Taunton. And when they interview them, they're not going to say, because it's in the press, they're not going to say, well, yeah, this is terrible, because then, people will think that they're not being patriotic. So a lot of them said, yes, we're all for it. Yeah, whatever it takes to win the war. But I'm not quite sure that was how they felt at the time. And you can walk there today. It's the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge. And there are 55 of those bunkers that are still there. And the pass, the tar pass you're walking on were actually railroad lines. There were POWs kept at a lot of these camps. There were POWs in at Fort Devens, at Camp Edwards, at Camp Miles Standish. There were some kept in Boston at Camp McKay. And a lot of them were able to go out and work. So this is a headline here. It says they were apple pickers. Some of them went up to New Hampshire to work in lumber. The Italians, after Italy surrendered in September of 43. So the Italians got a little special status. They were called Italian service units. They were considered co-belligerents, and they had a lot more freedoms. They could go out into the community and work, and they could go out and socialize. And a lot of them did, and they met nice young Italian girls, and some of them married them after the war. They built this little grotto, which is still there down in Taunton. It's now Miles Standish Industrial Park, and that's really the only remnant of the camp at the time. But even with all those freedoms, a lot of them wanted to escape anyway. And there were quite a few escapes, but most of them were caught within days because they really had nowhere to go. So with all of this training going on, all of these, new young pilots especially, there were a lot of crashes. In fact, there were over 100 military that were killed in crashes in the state of Massachusetts, and not on the air bases, all of them. Some of them happened in, closely packed suburban areas or farmland. There was one that crashed out by Holliston on the railroad tracks. So this is a particular place in Needham Wellesley area on Charles River and Grove that I was driving by all the time and saw this British flag. I had no idea until I started researching it. It actually happened on D-Day, so the 80th anniversary coming up in a few weeks. It was 2 British flyers named Albert Dawson and Sidney Wells. They had flown out from Squantum and Quincy, and the eyewitnesses were some young boys who heard a plane sputtering. They came out to see it, and the plane was pretty low at that point, and the pilots were waving the children away because they knew that they weren't going to make it. And so they really saved their lives. They crashed into a field, and this monument was put up many years later after some citizens, and I think the Needham Historical Society, checked into it and decided that they need to do this. These are where some of the other monuments are. Haverhill and North Reading. Peru was probably the worst. There were 19 paratroopers and crew that were killed. They crashed into what's called Garnet Mountain out in Peru, Mass.
Where's Peru?
Peru is in like near the foothills of the Berkshires, I believe.
Oh.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna skip that part. All right, so now we're coming to the end of the war, and I want you to think about that story I told you about December 9th, when people for an hour and a half thought we were being attacked by the Germans. I skip over VE Day, which was Victory Europe, which was in May of 45, because it was a little more subdued because we were still fighting in Asia. And but there were celebrations. People were out, impromptu parties, and people would grab whatever they could and bang them, and there were church bells ringing, and some people went to church. But the real big celebration was in August, VJ, which is Victory Japan Day. and it was pandemonium. There were a million people were in Boston that they counted. They were just going crazy. There was beer flowing in the streets. There were sailors dancing on the balcony, 5th floor balcony of a hotel. They were throwing women into the frog pond. And this says the theme is no kiss kerplunk. I mean, there's I know that's come up then. Oh well. Anyway, so and my mother had told me that she and her older brother, who was in the Navy, went down to Boston. She would have been about almost 18 at the time, and she attested to just how crazy it was and how happy people were. And so, and part of the reason they were happy is because they had been living with that fear that I talked about at the beginning for almost, a little over 4 years, almost 4 years, and the inconvenience. But they were also happy because they won, and all the opinions and interviews I read, it's we won and we defeated these really bad guys, and we saved the world for freedom and democracy. They really truly believe that, and so you can understand why they were so excited. That it was over. They defeated the bad guy. Some weird things were happening though throughout the course of the war, and this is another strange story that would be a believe it or not story. So during all that pandemonium, 1 million people gathered in Boston. This 16-year-old named Charlie Spataro leaves his home in East Boston, goes to sell his newspapers on the Common. He goes a little bit early because he wants to see what's happening. And while he's waiting, a young girl, well-dressed, about 25, comes up to him. She's holding a baby. She says, I need to make a phone call. Will you hold my baby? And gives him 2 $1 bills. And that's Charlie holding his 2 $1 bills. You can see he's a nice guy. Sure, I'll hold your baby. She never came back. She walked off into the crowd and no one ever saw her again. So Charlie is there on the Common. He's holding this baby. The baby was about 3 months old. That's the baby in the picture there. He's got to go sell his newspapers and he doesn't know what to do. So he enlists the aid of a couple of young girls from Dorchester. So they hold the baby. Charlie goes off to sell his newspapers. They look around. They can't find the woman anywhere. So eventually the 3 of them go to the police station on Joy Street, which is nearby, and they turn the baby in. And the next day there's headlines, eventually all across the country. Little Mr. Victory is what they call him. And who is Little Mr. Victory? They have pictures of him. They describe the clothing he was wearing, which was actually, pretty nice clothing. He seemed to be in good health. They did everything they could to try to find his identity. They took footprints. They had some leads. They went up to Maine. They went down to New Jersey. And as I'm reading this in real time for me in the newspaper archives, I'm like, all right, well, they're gonna, and then it just stops. There's nothing. And my guess is that they couldn't find anyone, so they had to do something with him. So they put him into the system, the social service system, and he probably got adopted. And that would have been the end of the story. But then, as I continued to look, I saw an article written 60 years later, the 60th anniversary of VJ Day. So Little Mr. Victory would now be 60 years old. And there was a writer from Boston who wrote a really good article, summed it all up. Didn't have any answers. A few weeks later, a letter to the editor from Charlie Spataro, of all people. He's 76 years old now. He corrected some of the inaccuracies in the original reporting. And he said, I really would like to know where Mr. Victory is too. He has no idea. And so I kept sleuthing. I took the name of that writer and I found him on Instagram. And I also found a reference to Little Mr. Victory in a post that he did about something totally unrelated. And it said that he was going to reveal the identity of Little Mr. Victory on his website. And then he didn't. So I got in touch with him on Instagram, and same day, within an hour, I got a response. And I told him, I said, I'm writing this book about World War II in Massachusetts. I came across this story, Little Mr. Victory, and how did it end? How did it end? He said, well, I'm writing a book too.
Oh.
And so you'll have to read my book to find out. So that's where that mystery ends. Little Mr. Victory will remain a mystery. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up by telling you this story. So this is my house in Framingham. It's built in 1917. And being a curious person, I love history, obviously, I like living in an old house. And so I said, while I was researching, and I use old newspaper archives, I said, all right, I'll just type in my address into the search on the newspaper archive. And I was kind of shocked and stunned when this article popped up. It describes two Framingham Flyers missing in action, one named Lieutenant Louis Carini. The other is Technical Sergeant Raymond J. Hickey of 29 Arthur Street, which is my house. So this is the article from April of 44 when he went missing on a bombing run over Germany. He was a radioman on a B-24 Liberator. So a little more research, and I found out that he was eventually, his status went from missing in action to killed in action, and his remains were returned to Framingham. And I was able to find his grave with the help of a researcher at the Framingham History Center. So I'm just going to read you the end of my book, which is, Raymond Hickey's story. And again, as to be researching World War II and living in an old house, and to find that this young man, he was only one of 87 Framingham soldiers killed, and I was living in his house. It kind of sent chills down my everything. So here's how I ended the book. So military enthusiasts enjoy touring the fields and forests across the globe where great battles took place. Standing in these spaces helps them imagine the chaos of the fight and the terror and the bravery of those fighting. One can get a similar experience in Massachusetts, standing on the deck of a battleship or a destroyer built in Quincy or Boston, praying in a hospital chapel in Framingham, or walking on the crumbling remains of a gun emplacement in Boston Harbor. The war on the home front, on the other hand, was fought by ordinary people in ordinary places, the train stations, town greens, city halls, and private homes of the state's 351 cities and towns. Those of us who happen to live in a house built before the war have the privilege of standing in kitchens where beleaguered moms created meals without basic ingredients of milk, sugar, butter, in backyards where victory gardens flourished, in garages where paper and rubber was stored before being hauled to the salvage drive, in living rooms and parlors where moms and dads read the daily newspaper and listened to news reports and presidential addresses on the radio. While working on this book in my Arthur Street home, the Hickey family was never far from my thoughts, as I pictured them struggling with the daily challenges of life during wartime, from the mildly inconvenient to the devastatingly tragic. The fact that a young man barely out of his teens left this house to serve his country and never returned is a powerful reminder to me of the sacrifice made by him and thousands like him. I am honored to share his story and add it to the annals of American heroes. And I'm especially honored on this coming up Memorial Day weekend to take somebody and put a story behind the stone, or in this case, the plaque. And so thank you for having me and sharing these stories with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Did you come across anything like I know you mentioned like theft of the coupon booklets for like the rations?
Yeah.
Rations. Did you run into anything that were like any kind of like counterfeit operations like that were like?
I don't remember specifically, but I'm sure that it was tried.
Sure, yeah.
I found stories about, people like there were people who took advantage of some of the blackouts to, commit crimes.
Yeah.
So as I said, I'm sure that there were people who said, oh, here's a sweet deal, let's do that. And but other than the one story that I found about the theft, I don't remember in particular.
So where I know you mentioned the I don't know a ton about Maynard, but I know that one of the things I know that there's a gun club. It's
Oh yeah, no.
Is that in a different part of Maynard?
Yeah, so I think it's on Hudson Road.
Okay, all right.
And heading towards Hudson, And it's,
62.
it doesn't have a route number.
Oh, okay.
Do you know where the fire academy is in Stowe?
Yeah.
So it's on that same road. It's before you get to the fire academy. It's on the right. And there's a big sign. I think it's a blue heron is on the sign.
Yeah.
And it's the Assabet. It's run by the Fish and Game Department, and it's the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge.
And it spans those like 4 counties.
Yeah, so the Army owned that property up until like the year 2000, and they did lots of other things there after the war. And then they gave some of it, but not all of it, to the Fish and Wildlife. And so that's the part that is, and that's the refuge. And there's ponds there, there's streams. They do have some nice installations where you can read and you can see a map of where the bunkers were. You can see some pictures of some of the farmhouses that stood there. There's a book that just came out from some Maynard guys called The Ammo Dump. And it's a pretty thorough history of this particular time in history from the time they decided to take the land, and then over the years, how it was used. And that just came out like in probably February, that book came out. And there's still some lingering, hard feelings with people that they feel they got, kind of, the government didn't treat them nicely.
Wondering about you were talking about the false alarm, the very first, and
Yeah.
but that they had tested their system basically, like, did they have that system because of World War I? And then what happened to it after World War II?
Yeah.
It would have helped us
Right.
a couple times.
Well, right, it was, what they saw was that, maybe system isn't the best word,
Yeah.
but it was the safety committee, so the Massachusetts Committee on Public Safety, which formed in August of 1940, knowing that war was coming, so they, so they set up, sort of the hierarchy and the organizational chart of how civil defense would be done. There was a national civil defense, but that was not, it didn't have as much to do with what was done on the local level. So they set up how, like, you would have to have you'd have to have a chairman in your town, and he would have to recruit volunteers and then find out a way to train them. And so so in Boston, there were these people who had already been trained as air raid wardens, and they had specific duties that they had to do, and it was all, again, in case of attack. I mean, because otherwise, why they weren't going over to Europe. So it was in case we are attacked, and especially being on the shore here, we need to be able to, put out fires. We need to be able to get people to hospitals. We need to be able to stop people, from coming into areas or whatever. So all of those things that you would do if there really was an attack, we need to keep people, if there was a bomb that landed, how do we keep people away from there? So that's what they were pleased with. I mean, there was some panic, and they were letting the school kids out, probably not the best idea. So there was some confusion, but in general, from what I've read, people didn't really panic. And they just went about as if it were a real attack.
Yeah, just the whole beginning part of your presentation, I was like thinking about COVID and like, should we have a similar system and what happened, and then the rationing and our toilet paper versus nylons, and there were so many similarities.
Yeah. And I think about also, like I said, 9/11.
Yeah.
If you remember, there were rumors, and I talk in the book about it. There was a rumor clinic, because as the war went on, there were just these crazy rumors, and again, people are scared. There was a rumor that one of them was, I tried to pick the craziest ones, that if women who had a perm when they went to work, I think it was like a munitions factory, that their head would explode. And so they had, maybe not that particular rumor was investigated, but they had it was with the FBI, the Boston Herald, and this rumor clinic would go out and investigate rumors. And you think about the rumors that we heard and the disinformation from 9/11 and COVID. So it was very similar, except this was for an extended period of time,
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
So I remember during COVID, and I've been thinking about this book, and as a teacher, I was home for a lot of time. And at first it was like, yeah, this is just like World War II. And, you know, people putting signs up, you know, and they were like, oh, let's praise our, you know, our first responders. And then that all kind of faded out. And then it was like, no, it's nothing like World War II. I mean, maybe for that little tiny, you know, window of time in the first few days, there was some similarities.
We didn't have a propaganda office like
Right. And the one that I didn't really emphasize it today because I was trying to be charitable to dog owners, but I really, I mean, I have a cat, so, and I love my cat, but I have siblings and nieces and nephews who have dogs.
I know, that's like heartbreaking.
And I just can't imagine them, you know, the one dog, he was in the wedding party, you know, he's in the Christmas picture. I just can't imagine today's dog owners saying, yeah, you know, take Bailey and maybe I'll get him back.
Right.
I mean, when I read that story about Sailor in the book, I got very emotional. As a dog owner, it's like, oh, they both love that dog so much.
Right,
They should both get to have the dog.
Yeah, they're hard decisions to make, but and you know, it's how they felt at the time, and maybe if we were at war, maybe, you know, we might change.
It's so interesting how like every industry got in on it, like the entertainment industry.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
the movies and everything. Like we didn't do that with COVID. Nobody was like.
No. Yeah, and I didn't talk a lot about it, but there were, you know, like in Framingham, the Dennison company, they just stopped, you know, making most of their products and made war products.
Yeah.
They made, you know, they had crepe paper and they were inventive. Like, all right, we make crepe paper. What can we do? Oh, we'll make little parachutes. So they made parachutes that could drop supplies and certain things like that.
Wow.
In Haverhill, which they had, you know, shoe manufacturing, so they made a lot of the leather goods like cartridge belts and things like that, and they did it pretty quickly too.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.